We are joined now by Will Backus. He covers college football for CBS Sports. Will, what's going on, man?
Oh, not much. I'm always excited to talk about ball with y'all, so thanks for having me on again.
Appreciate it. One of the reasons I like talking to you, Will, when we bring you on is there's always that certain comedic value, but like you get tons of perspective, especially where you're located. So I got to ask you about some contrasting styles, right? We get the Fran Browns that say, hey, listen, if I've got guys on our roster that aren't about being kind of team guys, and they're in a guys-to-go situation, no bold, no nothing, see ya. On the other hand, in a similar vein, we got guys like Dillingham say, you know what, like if you show up every day, you do the right thing, like you can stay with us even though you're leaving. If you're coaching and you've got to get ready for 2025, what stance are you taking as a coach to manage guys' decision-making in the portal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I definitely see where both coaches are coming from, because from Dillingham's perspective, you want to maintain those relationships with players, right? And, if a player says that they're leaving and you kind of take the stance of, all right, well, I'm done with you, you're dead to me, then that can kind of burn bridges, burn relationships. And, recruiting's entirely dependent upon relationships and money now too, but relationships are still important. And so I get that perspective where he wants to maintain those relationships by saying, you're still allowed around the building, we're still going to support you. And in the days of the portal, there's a chance that, these guys might swing back one day. So you want to keep that door open, especially if it's a really good player. But I also understand guys like Fran Brown who might feel a little bit burned by somebody leaving, in the middle of bowl prep. And I mean, I've seen teams that are preparing for the college football playoff that have guys entering the portal, and some guys that are important for depth too. And, they're still playing for a lot. And so I also get coaches being upset if you're doing it in the middle of preparing for a big game. I think I might tend to go a little bit more towards the Dillingham side, just because I said maintaining those relationships and making sure that you're keeping in good standing with those players, and not just those players, but players that they know and their family, and maybe even their high school coaches that they still talk to. I think it's important to maintain those relationships and be cast in a positive light by those players.
Well, I know there's some awkwardness, and you mentioned it there, of players being, their season still very much being alive, them having a lot to play for. They're playing for national championship potentially and being in the transfer portal. And I understand coaches being upset about that, but what choice do the kids really have if they want to move on, just based on the timing and the calendar, the way it's set up? Like, they really don't have an option without wasting a potential chance to play spring ball at their next location. Like, what do the coaches want the guys to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic point. Like, the timing just is really awkward because, it's obviously I've seen, I get a lot of the Tennessee perspective just because where I live, and Tennessee's had a couple depth guys into the portal, not guys that are going to start, but guys that have played a decent bit this year. And, I see fans get really upset when that happens. But, yeah, it's like, if you're a depth guy that plays a decent amount of time at Tennessee, you're probably going to get some good interest in the transfer portal. But right now is when you need to take that chance. Like, you can't really wait till spring or after spring practice, because right now is when schools are going to be really interested in adding a lot of guys through the portal. There's going to be some movement after the spring, too, when coaches get the chance to evaluate their rosters and really see what they have. But this tends to be the more active time. This tends to be the time where it's a lot better to kind of take that bet on yourself and put yourself out there and try to go somewhere different. And it's just unfortunate that it does kind of end up, right before the playoffs, because, the timing's hard there. So, yeah, I mean, I totally get it from a player's perspective of needing to get it done now. I just know that it's also really hard on coaches and very stressful on coaches, just the way it all lines up.
Let me ask you something, Will, while I've got you, about Tennessee specifically, because I've said this for about a month, and I'm curious to see what you think being so close to it. I felt like with all the hand-wringing and the consternation about what was going on with the playoffs and who was in, who was out, Tennessee was unusually safe for about a month. Right, they were kind of just penciled in without having to do much down the stretch, right? It's like, oh, they're safe. Like, because they didn't really have anything at stake, it put them in a better place. Why Did you get that sense, or is that just on the outside looking in, that of all the consternation of who's in, who's out, Tennessee was like never a question, was still just NC State and Bama on the resume?
Yeah, I mean, I think after the Georgia loss, there was a little bit of worry, especially with how they lost to Georgia, losing by 14 points in kind of their biggest game of the year. That was a tough spot. But, I mean, then you look up and down the bracket and you see teams like, all right, well, Ohio State lost to Michigan in the season finale. Indiana lost to Ohio State by a lot of points in their biggest game of the year. Penn State lost to Ohio State in their biggest game of the year. And I think once they kind of turned the corner to the end of the year against Vanderbilt, there was just kind of the feeling of, as long as we can beat Vanderbilt, handle our business against Vanderbilt, we're going to be in. Like, there's no question. And at that point, it kind of turned to, okay, are we going to host? What's going to happen then? So, yeah, I think down the stretch that people around Tennessee felt really comfortable with where they were, and they kind of realized that the Vanderbilt game was pretty much a playing game. Win that, and you're in.
Well, how did you feel? I know you're in SEC country over there, and obviously the conference wasn't thrilled about having fewer teams in the Big Ten and having, the Alabamas of the world left out. Did you think that was appropriate given what you've seen from that conference this year?
I think the committee made the right decision with what they did. It really came down to SMU and Alabama, right? That was kind of the debate over the last at-large spot. And I think it would have been a big mistake to punish SMU for playing in a conference championship game, especially given the way that game went. SMU erased two 17-point deficits and only lost on a last-second 56-yard field goal. First walk-off field goal in ACC championship game history. Like that, I don't know how you can punish a team for that when they've been in the college football playoff, for a couple months to that point, especially since they won 11 regular season games, went undefeated in their first season in a power conference. I think it would have been a huge mistake to put Alabama in, because then you create a situation where schools just don't care about conference championship games. Like, what's the incentive to play in a conference championship game if you're going to play in an extra game that most of the country does not have to worry about, and then you lose and get knocked out of the college football playoff, even though you've been there for weeks? Like, it doesn't make sense. I think that would have set a really dangerous standard. And so I understand why the SEC is upset. They like to point to strength of schedule, but if they want to put more teams in the college football playoff, then those teams need to win their games. I mean, it's as simple as that. Like, Alabama, don't lose to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma if you want to get in the college football playoff. I don't know why you feel like you're entitled to a spot after losing games like that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up strength of schedule with the SEC, because this is a thing that I feel strongly about. How much of the perception of the SEC strength of schedule is just based on the fact that we thought a lot of those teams were going to be good before the season started? Like, we look at it differently because of that, right?
Yeah. I think it definitely feeds itself. I'm not going to sit here and say that the SEC isn't a strong conference.
Sure.
It's a very strong conference. But, yeah, it feeds itself, and it is a lot of perception-based, especially since the SEC in recent years just hasn't scheduled a crazy difficult non-conference. You look at Alabama, their non-conference was Mercer, Western Kentucky, South Florida, and Wisconsin. And, they had to go to Wisconsin, but Wisconsin wasn't good this year. Georgia beat Clemson. Oklahoma beat Tulane. After that, there's just a whole lot of, okay. Texas beat a bad Michigan team, or a Michigan team that's in a down year. Their non-conference just isn't strong. So a lot of that strength of schedule is coming from playing in the SEC. And it is very difficult to play in the SEC, but I don't think that SEC teams should get into the playoff just because they play in the SEC. You've got to win those SEC games to get into the playoff. That's what I was saying with Alabama. Alabama can't lose to Oklahoma and Vanderbilt. Ole Miss can't lose to Kentucky and Florida. I think South Carolina, honestly, probably had the strongest case as a 9-3 team, just because two of those losses are against Alabama and Ole Miss, two ranked teams, and then they went hot down the stretch. But again, they lost 3 games in conference play, didn't make a conference championship. I don't think, unless there's all kinds of top teams that have lost 3 games. I don't think a 3-loss team should be taken seriously as a playoff team unless that 3-loss team wins the conference championship like Clemson or makes a conference championship and gets their 3rd loss in the conference championship. Otherwise, you just got to win the games that you have, regardless of how strong your schedule is, what that looks like. You just got to win the games that are put in front of you, and you should see it.
Well, let me ask you something. Okay, so we make you czar for a day, and you have the total luxury of revisionist history. You saw how this year played out. You heard the back and forth. You heard Ward Manuel. You heard Saban. You've heard everybody. If you were czar for a day, would you start with? And I'm going to say this kind of slow. Would you start with going back to divisions, losing the conference championship game, or reestablishing the criteria for seedings?
I think I would probably. I liked the kind of pod ideas that different conferences came up with, right? That was kind of like the NFL model. I don't know if I would go so far as having individual conference tournaments, but I think that there needs to be a way to break up the schools so it's not just an 18-team standing. Because scheduling is a nightmare. Like, you had so much variance in how teams scheduled this year that it just created all kinds of problems. Like, you had some really good teams. Like, honestly, I think Florida is a pretty decent team. But Florida's schedule was so impossibly difficult that they were never really in the conversation for anything more than, maybe Billy Napier's going to get fired, and then he's not. And so that was their season. But it was so difficult. Then you have an Ole Miss whose season was, by SEC standards, it's kind of a cakewalk. And there's even more disparity in conferences like the Big 12 and the Big 10, and even the ACC, like SMU. For as much as I really like SMU, glad they're in the playoffs, SMU didn't play a single ranked team on their conference schedule. So, there's a lot of disparity in the scheduling. They need to come up with some sort of format that fixes that. And also just the way that the conference tiebreakers played out down the stretch was just a nightmare. I felt like I had to get a mini PhD to understand what some of these scenarios were, especially in the Big 12 when you're entering the last week and there's 9 teams that have a chance to make it to the Big 12 championship game. I just kind of had to sit back and be like, what are we doing here? I like the chaos. It's kind of fun, but at the same time, it's just kind of a nightmare to pay attention to and cover. So I like a kind of pod format. I like division. I like something that separates the schools into a more manageable way, and something that also guarantees that schools are playing a more level kind of schedule. I know it's impossible to have everybody play the same type of schedule, but there needs to be a little bit more unity with the scheduling and a little bit more, fairness with the scheduling. So,
Will, real quick, and this goes back to COVID, so it's not like, he just wants to have been right. But I am curious to get an objective opinion. I was one of those guys that all along never liked the idea of expansion without some sort of conference uniformity. I said, hey, you have to at least decide on the number of conference games before we do this mega thing, right? Because I felt like, and in full disclosure, it stemmed from the Big 12 panicking when it was Baylor and TCU because it wasn't Oklahoma and Texas years ago. So they decided to go to the conference championship game, whatever. Do you feel, is it rational or feasible to think that you could have had some sort of resolution about conference uniformity before you were kicking the can down the road?
I think so. It's not like these schools just kind of fell in these conferences last, right? And they were just like, oh, well, we got to deal with this now. It wasn't a surprise to them.
Right, and then there was kind of the secret collusion not secret, but we knew that the Big Ten and SEC were talking a year ago about this or before that. So it just seems like I thought the easy answer was, well, they kicked the can down. And I'm kind of thinking of a response I got on social media where I just had to roll my eyes. But I'm like, no, this was plenty doable before we got to this point.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the SEC now, right? The SEC is still panicking over, well, we're going to play 8 games, conference games, or we're going to play 9 conference games. How did you not figure this out?
I couldn't believe Saban had the gall to say that Sunday.
Yeah.
And he said it with a straight face.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't understand how they didn't think of this before adding Texas and Oklahoma, because, those conversations were going on for probably at least a couple of years before the news broke. And even when the news broke, you didn't have Texas and Oklahoma joining for another year. And so it's like these things, these aren't a surprise. These didn't happen overnight. I think it's realistic to say, these conferences really could have come up with something better before it became such a big issue. And so, I mean, I think there's probably going to be more expansion that happens. I think it's honestly an inevitability. And so I hope that when the next round comes, these conferences have something solid figured out, because at least now they have the experience, right? Not that these conferences haven't expanded before, but this time was just a little bit different with the 12-team college football playoff, transfer portal, NIL, everything, complicating matters a little bit. So hopefully by the next time it rolls around, they've got the experience that they need to sit down and figure it out and come up with a more sustainable, less chaotic model for it.
So, Will, I got a buddy who he sent this message to me this morning, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people don't advocate on the side of the players. So I don't hear this often. But he says, I think the system is kind of rigged to force kids' hands. The window is in a terrible spot for them. Too late to get in and you miss the opportunity, but you still have something to fight for if you're playing any sort of meaningful games. I had to think about that for a second, so I'm going to pose it to somebody smarter than me. Would you move? Is there a way to make it more advantageous is the wrong word, easier for movement without feeling like you're under the gun to make decisions that are ill-informed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, right? In an ideal world, I think there would only be one transfer window, and that was after spring practice. So that way coaches have a really good opportunity to sit down and evaluate, okay, what does our team look like this upcoming season? What do we need? And, I mean, unfortunately, on the business side, who are some players that we can afford to be we can let them go, and it's not too big of a headache. But at the same time, it also gives players the opportunity to really get a sense for where they stand with the team, especially entering a new year, right? Because the December window, we're still in the 2024 season right now. It's kind of harder to evaluate what the future is going to look like right now. When you're talking spring practice, you're preparing for the next season. And so it's a lot easier for players to get a sense to be how do I fit in this team now? Even maybe freshmen that enrolled earlier and came to spring practice, they have a chance to evaluate, is this really what I was promised? Is this what it looks like for me? Or is this what I was told it would look like? Players get a chance to see where they stand. They get a chance to evaluate their future. So in an ideal world, I think there would be one transfer window after the spring. I don't think that's going to happen just because of how much movement tends to happen, and also just the way the calendar shakes out with coaches want to have their roster in place well before spring practice even starts. And so, I think that crunch is going to make it really difficult to have that, especially since, like I said, a lot of these guys want to get players in before spring practice because, that's when they start to do a lot of install for the next year. That's when they get the team kind of ready for everything. And that's when a lot of the groundwork is kind of built. And so I think the next best solution would maybe be after bowl games, but then you're talking about stretching that into January. And that's also pretty late just with the schedule and the way the calendar works out. So I don't know if there's an ideal solution. I just think it's a really tough situation with the way it is now. And I just kind of hope players have the right people in their ears when they're making these decisions in December, because a lot of guys that end up hopping in the portal, unfortunately, don't find what they're looking for. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's sad, but it definitely does come down to the players to have to kind of make their own really informed decisions. So I hope that they've got the right people that are kind of telling them things.
Yeah.
Well, kind of changing gears on you here a little bit. One of the other big stories kind of floating around college football right now is the possibility that Bill Belichick might be going to North Carolina, or at least there's interest there. Like, how does that strike you? Like, I find it a little hard to imagine, but then I hear him on Pat McAfee yesterday, and I'm like, he's kind of, what he's saying kind of makes sense to me. Like, how does that sit with you?
It sounded like he was already recruiting on the Pat McAfee.
It seemed like a pitch.
Yeah, talking about getting guys to the NFL and those connections. Yeah, it seemed like a very strong recruiting pitch. I mean, look, I've kind of made it my stance to try to never make strong takes about a coaching hire because there's just so much variability with them. Like, it's so hard to say how a guy's going to do. That being said, Bill Belichick is an incredible coach, obviously. You don't need me to tell you that. He's done amazing things in his career. I do not see the vision here. And here's why. He's 72 years old. You just fired 73-year-old Mac Brown. When you're hiring for a college football program, you should be hiring for the future. Like, you're not hiring because, especially at a school like North Carolina, which maybe doesn't have quite they've got a lot of resources, but maybe not quite the resources like a top-end SEC or Big Ten school. You're hiring for the future, not because you think a coach is going to come in right now and immediately turn things overnight, right? You want to hire a guy that's going to build a program that's going to be able to give you consistent, improving seasons. And I'm not saying Bill Belichick can't do that, but I just think it's hard to ask a 72-year-old coach who has never spent any time in college to come into what college is now and immediately, like, hit the ground running and be a home run hire.
So that's the difference between he and Mac Brown, right? Mac has experience, even though age is similar.
Yeah, and even then, like, I think you could kind of tell that the game was starting to get past Mac Brown a little bit, just because he reached that threshold where, he came up and he had his prime success when college football was an entirely different animal. And so with a lot of the modern changes, like, I just don't know if he acclimated super well. Like, you look at North Carolina's recruiting.
He got off to such a good start, though.
Yeah, he did get off to a great start, and that's kind of my worry with Bill Belichick, is that maybe he's going to come out and immediately make a huge splash, but then, like, I don't know if he's got the background necessary and the experience necessary to kind of build the foundation that you need to have that sustained success in college. And, like, I know he said a lot of the right things on the Pat McAfee show. Like, he's very clearly spent time studying college football. He's very clearly spent time catching himself up to it. But it's one thing to have, like, an 1,000-foot view of it, and then it's another thing to get in there. Like, I don't think Belichick at 72 years old knows the mental tax that it's going to take to constantly text 17 and 18-year-olds to make sure that they're still interested in your school. Like, this isn't the NFL where, they're all kind of like adult professionals. Like, we're talking about high school recruiting, where even if a guy's committed to you, you got to reach out to him every single day to make sure that he's still committed, make sure that he's not visiting somewhere else, make sure that another school didn't come in with some crazy NIL offer. Like, I think that's going to be a really difficult adjustment for him. Even if he has the frame of mind where, like, he's studied up, he knows the rules, he's clearly very informed, very successful coach. Like, that's just difficult for someone to handle, and especially, I hate to say age is a concern, but I think it is at this point, because, I mean, you've seen guys like Nick Saban, who he was still in the prime of his career, fresh off a college football playoff year, and he was like, it's become too much for me. I can't keep up with this anymore. So, yeah, I think it would be an interesting hire. He could be successful. I just don't think it's the right hire for a school like North Carolina to make.
That's Will Backus from CBS Sports. Will, we appreciate the time. As always, talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Philip.
More Hurrdat Sports Radio coming up next.